In this tutorial, I'm going to focus on defensive positions, entrenchments, forts, structures, defending in regions. Then I'm going to move on to movement and how movement works in the game and the effects of weather and terrain on movement. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the battle screen, the battle results and how battles actually unfold in the game. So first and foremost, let's focus on defensive structures. I'm going to focus somewhat on forts because although it doesn't seem like forts have a big place in the game, they actually kind of do if you use them correctly. And a lot of it has to do with zone of control. That's a big aspect to it. And then also fleet bombardment. So first, with regards to zone of control, let's talk to that really quick here. So zone of control basically dictates how likely the enemy is to pass through your region without firing a shot. You can imagine that could be pretty problematic, right? If you've got a fairly large enemy stack that you're facing off against and they just pass right by you unscathed because you're in your nice little earthworks on the defensive posture like we are here, defensive posture, and instead of actually engaging in battle, Butler just passes on through and hits Manassas. Now all of a sudden, I'm cut off from my main supply line. That's pretty problematic, right? There's a couple different ways to influence zone of control to force the enemy to actually go to blows with you if they decide to attempt that. One way is military control, which I talk about in the prior tutorial. I'm not going to cover that here. So just be aware that military control is one aspect that allows you to control the movement of your enemy. Another, though, is the zone of control, and one way to do that is through the building of forts. So first, notice there's two ways to place a unit on the field. There's either inside a structure or inside a region. So, or I guess on the field in the region. How can you tell where a particular unit's at? Well, you look at the little icon next to the structure, and that'll tell you how many stacks are inside that structure. So in this case up here, we have one stack inside this fort. You click it, it'll show you who it is. Here we have Wise's brigade, and he is housed up inside the fort. Now, foot stomp. You cannot put as many troops or elements as you want into a fort or a structure without suffering a penalty. In this case, for forts, you can have up to 25 elements in that fort before you start suffering a combat penalty in combat. So how can you tell? If you go down here to the bottom right with this little circular thing, it says you're stationing 3 elements in the region structure with a safe limit of 25. So if we overcrowd it, in other words, if we have 26 or more elements in the fort, we're going to start suffering combat penalty modifiers as a result of that. Just think of it this way. You can only pack so many people into a fort. At some point, it becomes much more difficult to move, give orders, reload, resupply, all that stuff. So that's what the game is essentially doing there. It's going to penalize you once you put too many troops in there. For cities, it's 10 per city level. So Baltimore can house 120 elements before it starts suffering a negative penalty. But again, that's for structures. That's not for the region. There is no penalty for regions per se. I'll get to that in a second in terms of frontage. But as far as structures, look at that number there, and that'll tell you how many elements you can house inside that structure. Notice down here the number represents a 3. See how we got this dude hanging out here? If I click that, notice we actually have 4 stacks here, not 3. So why does it say 3? Well, because he's not actually inside the structure. He's in the field. So another way to tell, in addition to this little 1 here, whether that card is inside a structure or in a field, is to look at the tab up here. So there's nothing there, which means that's telling you that, hey, he's in the field. Down here, notice these little houses. That's telling you that these stacks are inside the structure. Now, these guys are in here because I just built them. I'm going to actually move them this turn. But what this does, it's a good illustration here that even though this guy looks like he's inside the structure, he's actually not. Because he doesn't have that little house thing. So just be aware of that. It's important to know, especially when you're kind of devising strategy. Foot stomp on this one too. You don't get bonuses to, how do I say this? You don't get defensive modifiers from the region, the landscape, and the fort, or the landscape and the structure. It's one or the other. So right now, Wise Brigade, if he were attacked, any kind of advantages that he would receive would be dictated by the field that he is on, not by the fort. So if we push the number 7, that gives you the landscape. So he is on hills, And as you can see, the offensive and defensive numbers there, 100%, 100%, so on and so forth. Basically, the hills don't really influence all that much how a battle would unfold, at least right here. Okay. However, if you were in like a swamp or a mountainous area, it would probably make sense to have your troops outside the structure. So like over here, I've got Gustav Smith. He's actually not inside that city because we don't have that icon there. And his terrain over here is mountains with snow and harsh weather. So notice that anyone who attacks is going to receive, their effectiveness is going to be reduced down to 30%, and their cavalry and artillery is going to be reduced down to 45%, while our defensive aspects are only reduced by 10% for regulars and then down 40%, so 60% total for cavalry and then 60% for artillery. We would not get those modifiers though if we were inside the structure. Okay. However, and there's always a trade-off, you do not suffer attrition if you're inside a structure. So this guy's hanging out outside of Lewisburg right now in this nasty weather. He's likely to suffer some attrition here pretty soon if I have him hanging out here for too long. So that's the downside to it. You just have to be careful though, because if I were to move him into the city, I'm going to lose that entrenchment unless I rotate troops. So let me talk to entrenchment really quick here before I finish off with the zone of control. Notice that entrenchment's dictated by this little squiggly line down here. It's a 3 for the Army of the Potomac. And I've made this mistake, so I'm going to point it out here. If you want to maintain that entrenchment level in that region, make darn sure you pull a unit out of that stack before you move that stack, because you're going to lose that entrenchment level if you don't. So, good example, if I want to move the Army of the Potomac up to Harper's Ferry, I'm going to want to pull either a division or whatever I want to leave here out first. See how 3rd Division has the 3 entrenchment? Then take the Army of the Potomac and move it. That way I can always come back and I still have that entrenchment level at Alexandria. So just be aware that if you move a stack, you're going to want to make sure you maintain an entrenchment level by pulling a card or a division or whatever out of that stack first, as kind of the guys hanging out maintaining the entrenchment, and then move your stack. Entrenchments are based on 1 per level. 1 equals 100% modifier in combat. So if you have 3, it's 300%. You can get up to 4, and then after that, 5, 6, 7, and 8 entrenchment levels are based on the number of artillery that you have in that stack. So if we wanted, for example, this stack to get up to 5, we'd need a certain amount of artillery present in the stack to make that happen. What you can do is you can hover over it and it'll tell you the next level you're going to be reaching. So here we're going to reach level 4 in 11 days. And then what it'll tell you is if we have enough artillery in the stack, it'll say, hey, we're working on level 5 right now. So just be aware of that. Zone of control, though, is directly relating to entrenchment, because if we don't have a solid zone of control, then he could just pass on through and avoid our entrenchment. So if you look down here, it's red. That's basically telling us that, like, hey, we're kind of limited actually in our ability to attack. So notice our zone of control here is 334. The fort adds a substantial amount to your zone of control, and so here we have a stack of 93, and yet our zone of control is already 133. It's already almost a third with this huge stack over here, which is hanging out inside of a stockade with the entrenchment and everything. That's because these forts help substantially with your zone of control. So what you can do is you can use forts as a way to delay the enemy, and in time for you to either go around and cut off their supply line or bring up reinforcements. So I could use a substantially smaller force right here, put it inside the fort, and then if a stack like this came along, my zone of control would likely stop it if I had, say, almost a division-sized force there, and then he would have to besiege that fort before he could move on. Also note that if I had a supply wagon in here with Wise Brigade, then there's only a 5% chance per turn during the siege of him actually surrendering. So that's really important to know as well, is that if you intend to use these forts as a way to kind of slow down the enemy and force them to besiege that area before moving on, definitely put a supply wagon inside, because that's going to drastically reduce the possibility of surrender by the units inside the fort. Do note, though, that you're going to be, remember, you're going to be limited by the number of elements you can have inside the fort, so that's going to be your limiting factor. You don't have that same sort of limitation in the field, so you can have 40, 50, 60 elements in the field, but if you had 40 or 50 or 60 elements inside a fort, you're going to be in big trouble when you get attacked. Let me adjust course here a little bit. Speaking of forts and defensive positions, artillery. Let's talk to that just really quick here. So, in order for your artillery to actually bombard passing ships, they need to be either heavily entrenched or probably more likely in a fort. How can you tell whether your artillery is in a position to actually blast ships passing by? You go over here, it'll say, land bombardment. It'll say you cannot toggle the bombardment passing ships behavior. Reasons may be not enough range for your guns. You need 5 or higher, which this one we do, I believe. I think we have 5 range. Yeah, here's your range right here under overview. No, combat under range. But also, we are not entrenched enough, so you need 5 or higher on your entrenchment, which can be very hard to get. I think what's our entrenchment level with this one is only 3. And we've got 59 days to get level 4. Or they're not in a fort. So units in forts always bombard passing ships and can always be fired upon by passing ships. So what I have to make sure is I put him in a fort. I believe he is in a fort. That's the icon right here. And so even though this isn't lit up, he would still fire. So that's good to know. But just be aware that they have to be inside a fort. Almost certainly, because that entrenchment is just crazy high. You'd have to really high to do that in order for them to shoot at passing ships. It's not going to do you any good to just have them sit in the field, because they're probably not going to do it. So just be aware that that is an issue, and that you also need 5 or more range on your cannon to even shoot. And then obviously you probably don't want to be using 6-pounders, because they're not going to do much to passing flotilla. As a final note on that too, artillery is phenomenal at shooting from entrenched or forts. So if you can get them in forts, please do so, because they make a substantial difference in the game. All right, so I'm going to talk really quick here how to build forts, just very briefly. There's a couple different ways to do it. One is the action card up here, so build outpost. They're not as strong as the ones you would be able to build in the field, but it's a nice way to get them on there. It'll tell you what the requirements are. So the region must be owned, not have a city, and development level must not be higher than 75. Need at least 1 combat unit. So pretty low standard to build an outpost somewhere. You just really need 1 combat card in an area that does not have a city, and you're good. So up here, like Cache River, we could build it up there, and it only takes a turn to do it. So that's pretty cool. So that's what we did here. We actually did that. We plunked that down. So now, if I wanted, I could stick him inside the fort and get him a supply wagon. And then if later in the war Grant came down with a massive army, his division, which would be more than 188, maybe say 300 against his 1,200, would be forced to besiege that fort and take it before he could move on, because it would stop him in his tracks. So I'd put him inside, for example. And then notice too, when we click him, it'll tell us we got 9 elements in there, and we can have up 25. So that's the card option there. Another way is actually to take a rather large stack. I'm not quite sure what the requirement is, but at some point the stack is large enough to where you can go to this little hammer here and you can build a fort. Now you can't build a fort in a city structure, so we'd have to be over here at Triggs, Kentucky or something like that with this stack. But then you could theoretically build a fort there as well with your actual stack. Finally, the other way, the last and final way to do it is like we did down here in New Orleans. You build, if you have 4 elements of artillery, it could be any kind of artillery, so I always do 6-pounders because they're the cheapest. So if you had 4 elements of artillery and a supply wagon with 4 elements, then you could build a fort inside a city. So that's what we did. We went and got 4 artillery elements and 4 elements of supply, and in 25 days we built Fort Iberville, Louisiana, which now means that we have a fort inside our city, and we can basically put artillery, which we have here, all inside. So like these 4, I wouldn't use 6-pounders to defend Louisiana. I'm actually building these to send them up to Bowling Green to build another fort up there, but then I would put 12-pounders or something like that here as another way to defend the city, because the coastal artillery batteries are really expensive. So there's the 3 different ways you can build a fort. Again, I think it's an important aspect of the game that oftentimes gets overlooked, because it can drastically assist you in your zone of control, controlling the rivers, forcing your opponent to fight you where you want them to fight you, rather than just passing on by. And then finally, I will talk to how these coastal forts work in the blockade tutorial. But with that, let's move on to movement really quick. Okay, before I move on to how the battles unfold and kind of how the mechanics in that work, I just want to cover movement here very quickly. First, I want to highlight the activation role. If you're not familiar with that term and how it works in the game, please go over to my tutorial on generals and their traits and characteristics, because I do cover activation roles pretty substantially there. Also be aware that there's this tab called traffic penalty that you can move around. You can either have it off, low, medium, or high. I have it on medium. What it's supposed to do is it's supposed to impose additional impacts on movement that would hopefully replicate as much as possible the different logistical concerns and issues and problems that Civil War armies faced in the Civil War. So what I mean by that is that if you were to move a very large force through a narrow mountain range or through a narrow roaded area or whatever, the traffic penalty will take that into account and enhance the amount of cohesion that your stack may lose, and also increase the amount of time it would take for that stack to get through the region. So be aware that you can play around with that. I think it's kind of a cool thing to have. It definitely adds another layer to the game and a bit more realism to it. But here, if you push number 8, it'll show you the weather, okay? I also have on my options, it'll show me what the weather kind of looks like when I have the UI tabs completely off. But pressing number 8, it'll show you what the weather's like in that particular area. For example, if you highlight over here, it's muddy, which is really bad for cavalry. It takes cavalry a lot longer to traverse the areas because of the mud. Up here, obviously, it's snow and weather. And what the weather will do is it is kind of common sense, but it's going to have additional negative modifiers associated with any sort of offensive operations you may take. Interestingly enough, the weather doesn't really affect you defensively. You do suffer some attrition hits if you're in the field in harsh weather, but otherwise, all of the negative combat modifiers that would be associated with the weather are attributed to the attacker. So just be aware of that. I found that kind of interesting. I didn't realize that it's really just only the attacker who suffers the penalties attacking in harsh weather elements. So notice here when you hover over it, it'll tell you, hey, look, it's clear, snow, clear being the landscape is clear, but there's snow on the ground and it's harsh weather. And if I were to attack at St. Louis right now, assuming the weather did not clear up in the next 10 or 14 days, that's the kind of weather we're looking at if we were to fight in this region. And just to give you an illustration of what this means, in the manual it says for snowy weather, there's a moderate penalty to movement and supply transport. In combat, there's a moderate penalty for the attacker, and the battle starts at close range. And then for attrition, all stacks suffer attrition unless sheltered, which means you have the stack inside a structure. And then it also said harsh weather, which I believe could indicate that it may be getting to the point where it's going to be a blizzard, which would then have even further penalties to your stacks. So just be aware that weather can play can be very impactful and influential over how a battle goes. I could go into this with a substantially larger stack than him, and because I'm attacking across the river in winter, and my cohesion is going to take a significant hit traveling in this kind of weather, by the time I get to St. Louis and engage the enemy, I might already be substantially reduced in strength, and then the actual battle itself would probably not go well. And that's how weather can be real damper, because like right now I'm doing pretty well. I'm up in Salem. I was ready to move on St. Louis, but then the weather kicked in, and now I'm kind of forced in a situation where I'm probably going to have to just stand pat, and hopefully I can maintain my gains here and then push to St. Louis in the spring. All right, now for the nuts and bolts of this tutorial, we're going to talk about battle mechanics, and more specifically frontage, and kind of how frontage, for the most part, influences the game. So what is frontage? So think of frontage as you're on the battlefield, and given the terrain that you're on will limit or maximize the number of troops that you can put into combat at any given time. There's really two kinds of frontage. There's open, there's closed. But more specifically, really, there's clear / like woods, which is this right here, and then everything else, all right? So clear and woods are really important to understand, and then like prairies and deserts, because you get actually a bonus modifier from your generals if you're fighting in those types of terrain. So let me explain frontage here really quick, how to interpret it, and then we'll talk about that aspect of the game. So if you hit 7, you'll get your terrain pull up again. Let's look at the clear. Let's look at dire. Currently we're on the 2nd Corps, and this will kind of show you, gives you a glimpse of what you can put in that particular region with that element, or rather with that stack. So if we did 3rd Corps, notice it's 26.8. Did 2nd Corps, it's still 26.8, 27.8. and so forth. So when I'm looking at this for the stack in elements, let's just go back to brag here real quick. All right, so dire Tennessee is clear terrain. So remember the difference, clear and woods. You want to kind of keep that separate and apart from all other terrain. Notice frontage, width, and points. So it says for line elements, you get 180 points on offense and defense. And then for support elements, you get 60 offense and defense. And then further down there, it says for the stack in elements, for line elements, you get 26, and for support elements, 8. So what the hell does that mean? All right, so the points first are deduced from your elements themselves. So let's click the 18th and 19th Alabama. And what it does, this card tells you the amount of points that that particular element uses up from the total frontage available to you. So there you had 180 frontage. This uses up 4 frontage points out of your total of 180. That's for that one element right there. However, if you're fighting on what's considered closed terrain, like hills, swamps, forests, mountains, that sort of thing, then they're going to use up 18 total points. So to distinguish between clear and hills, notice here, you only get 130 offensive points to use here. If you were, say, attacking somebody at Perry, Tennessee. And so this element, just by itself, would use up 18 of that 130 points. So the first, I think, tip from this tutorial is know that there is a difference on the number of elements you can field depending on terrain. And the way you can figure that out, if you really want to get down and dirty with it, is to actually open up each individual element and add it all up, because it'll tell you right here how many. I would say typically line infantry, it's going to be 4 and 18. Cavalry, it's going to be like 2 and 17. That's at least for the light cavalry. And then artillery, it's 4 and 20. So they use up a ton of space on closed terrain. All right, so that's clear and woods, and then everything else. All right, that's going to be the difference. Also here, for the line elements. So now notice though that even though you can use up 180 points and you can put up to 26 line elements into dire Tennessee, bear in mind that you may not actually be able to put 26 elements on the battlefield. And why do I say that? That's because your elements may use up all the 180 points before you get the total of 26 on there. So again, going back here, right? If we are fighting at Perry, Tennessee, and it says we can get 14 elements on there, but we're using up 18 every single element, it's very possible we're not going to get 14 line elements up there before that 130 is used up. So even though I think that bottom number, the 26 and 8 is helpful, What's even more helpful for you are the actual points, because once you expend those points, that's it. You're not going to be able to put any more elements there, okay? However, foot stomp. If you are fighting in clear or wooded regions, then you actually get a bonus from your generals. And what do I mean by that? There's a modifier basically says that, hey, because they're being led by generals, their rank plus whatever their offensive or defensive number is increases by a percentage the number of elements that can be fielded on the battlefield at any given time. So, for example, Breckenridge here is a badass. The he's a 2-star, and he's got a 3 offensive abilities. So as long as our posture is an offense, we're going to benefit from that 3 number. If we were defense, then we benefit from the 2 number. But say we're going to offense and we were going to move to Dire. Actually, let's put him here. I'm going to simulate all this for you too. So let's put him in Humboldt. So this is considered open terrain. And I pulled this from the Civil War II forums, by the way. This is really helpful information. In open terrain only, clear, prairie, desert, or wood, the unit's quotas, in other words, the number of elements that you can put on the battlefield at any given time, is modified by the leader's rank. So in this case, Breckenridge is 2 times whatever his offensive and defensive rating is, depending on the posture. So in this case, 3. So 2 times 3. And then plus 25 points. So he would basically get a bonus of 6 times 25. That's the number of points. Again, points being right there. So he would add that number of points to his line elements and support elements he could put on the battlefield. So support elements, I think, is like half of it. It's like another 60. So he could put like 120 support element points on the battlefield, and then he could put another 625, another probably 140, 150 points towards that 180. Okay, so now it's frustrating because it doesn't actually show that here when I modify it. You just kind of have to know that that rule's out there. And so I guess the best way to remember is just, hey, try and do battles in woods and in clear areas if you have good generals. And if you don't have good generals, maybe try and fight it out in the hills, mountains, and so forth. But if you have a guy like Lee or Grant or Longstreet or whomever it might be who's an awesome general, know that you're going to get massive bonuses to the number of troops you can put on the battlefield if you're fighting in open terrain, open frontierland. All right. That's also why it's really important, I think, to put good generals as corps commanders, because he's going to be able to get more of his corps on the battlefield at a given time than a poor general who is a corps commander. All right. So some other ways that the computer decides who to select in battle is essentially, is the unit already engaged, like have they already been attacked? Because then the chances are they're going to remain engaged in future rounds. And also, if they're beginning to rout, then it's possible if you have reserves available that the computer will pull those reserves and put them in place of the unit that's routing. Note, though, that even though we only have one sharpshooter element here out of the stack, that he doesn't get precedence in being selected for battle. In other words, all 3 of these cards could go to battle and he could be a reserve. However, and this is pretty cool, even if he's not actually engaged in the first round of combat, these elements here will still benefit from this bonus here, +1 initiative. So they'll still get the bonus even though he's in a reserve status. He just won't actually be doing any firing. So just bearing that in mind, it's a pretty cool feature to be aware of and know. Do note, and this is a really important foot stomp, that certain terrain subtracts 25% for the unit's point totals in that particular region. So take again Breckenridge, right? Say we went to Perry, Tennessee to fight it out there. He can only put 130 points up on the into that region before he caps out for his line elements. However, if he's in an offensive posture, so he's attacking, he's not in the defense, he's going to suffer a 25% penalty to that 130 points. The defense does not suffer that penalty. So if Breckenridge was at Perry, Tennessee defending, he could put 130 points there. But if he was attacking, he would suffer a 25% decrease on that point total for the number of elements that he could put on the battlefield. So again, another illustration of how this game is very defense heavy, and really kind of any kind of attacking you're doing, you're already at a disadvantage in terms of a number of things. But you do suffer that 25% decrease for attacking in non-open frontage, so not clear and not woods. But if Breckenridge had attacked in clear or wooded areas, then he would get a bonus to his total elements. Although so would the your opponent as well. Just bear that in mind. Okay, so I'm going to simulate a battle here really quick for you. I'm actually moving. Let me move him up here too. I've got the cavalry under... Who is this, by the way? I have no idea who this is. But this is obviously Forrest. And I'm moving him along with a couple of my corps, Hardy and Breckenridge, up to Humboldt. And then I'm going to move my second corps under Bragg and my first corps under Polk here, along with my army command, which is obviously General Johnston. And what I want to show you is hopefully there'll be some marching to the sound of guns. In other words, Polk and or Bragg will march up to Humboldt to support our army up there if that's where the attack is. And my objective here is kind of show you how marching to the sound of guns works, and then also too to kind of go through really kind of piecemeal how to kind of interpret the battle result menu, because I do think it's very helpful if you can kind of understand how it works. It'll do a lot, I think, to help you understand where you can improve on your generals and the makeup of your army and so forth. I'm hoping they'll attack me here because I kind of just threw a bunch of guys in there to get an attack. I didn't really do any strategy. I just threw everybody in there. Like, attack me, damn it! There we go! Hooray! That was not the major battle I was hoping for. There we go. Nice. Okay, good. Okay, so let's go through those battles, shall we? Which one was the big one? This was not the big one. Here was the big one. Okay, so this is how you interpret it. So if you have it like this, E means the total overall result. So this gives you kind of the overall numbers of how things happened. Let's just go through that very quickly here. We inflicted 164 hits total on the enemy. I'm a little unclear on this. I think it's basically we inflicted 1,200 total power damage on him, reducing his overall power by 1,200. And he did the same. So he inflicted 108 hits on us, reducing our overall power number by 1,300. I believe that's how you interpret it. This one's always confused me a little bit. I do know it's tied to power somehow though. We had 38,000 troops on the battlefield. He had 20,000, almost 21,000. We lost 32,000. He lost 48. We had 9,000 cavalry, lost 37,600, and then 5 artillery and so forth. As you can see over here, the postures. It'll show you the postures of the units going into the battlefield. And then over here, there's some overall bubbles here. So as you can see, our ammo, our general supply, there was no surprise achieved, which you'll usually get a bonus to initiative, which basically means you get more first fires, which in this game, first fires and initiative is very important for determining, I think, the overall, the way that the battle is going to go. So really any kind of troops or generals that give you initiative, you definitely want to have them in there. We have a little bit of entrenchment, probably because we got there on day 3 and then had several days. So the battle occurred on day 12. We got there on day 3, so we had 9 days to entrench. That's why we got this entrenchment bonus. No units try to retreat, and then you can see here number of elements failing a morale check, and no captured equipment. So those last couple are very important to show you getting to the battlefield early. So in our case, on day 3, gives your troops the opportunity to rebuild cohesion in the event that you do get attacked, like we did here on day 12. So bear that in mind. So that's the overall battle. Okay, so that's the E. So the S is the start. So this will tell you who started the battlefield. Notice he had 5 generals plus the overall commander, Buell, start the battle. That's actually pretty impressive. We had 3. We had General Johnston, and then we had Hardee and Headman. So first, bear in mind that Johnston was actually down here in Madison, Tennessee, even though the battle happened in Humboldt. That's a good example of when you have your army structure such that I did. Your army commander is always going to govern or always going to control the battlefield so long as he's at least adjacent to the battle. So even though one of our corps was actually attacked, not our army stack, our army general actually kind of dictated how things went. So that's the first important thing to note. It's very easy to get stuck into this whole, well, Johnston's here, so he's only going to command what's here. No, he actually dictated how the battle went up in Humboldt, even though he was down in Madison, Tennessee. Now, each one of these rounds, we had only had 2 rounds of battle. Each round represents an hour of battle. And what happens at each hour is that at each hour, the computer goes back and looks at the fatigue level for the big brigades or the batteries that are on the battlefield at the time, the number of hits sustained, and so forth, and then decides whether it's going to swap out some of those line infantry with reserves, and then there's some sort of roll done to determine whether it's even possible. So the more rounds that you have fought, the better for a larger army, because theoretically you have a lot more reserves available, and therefore each round you swap out in all those reserves. So first, the first round here. So again, notice starting round we only have the 2 generals there. The third round though, Bragg showed up, so I'm going to talk to that in a moment. But first round we've got Hardee and Headman, and this basically is all the different brigades that were available to your particular commanders on the battlefield. So, more specifically, Headman here, all these units here, all these stacks, that's basically the possibility. So this one here, Headman's brigade actually fought in that battle. But Claiborne's and Wood's did not, it looks like. So Claiborne's and Wood's, so I can go look at that here in a moment. Claiborne. Okay, so Woods did fight, although he didn't suffer any injuries. And then for whatever reason, he actually got pulled out. So that's one way to look at these things, is this right here, all right here, is the offensive, let's see here, your total points that you can put as far as your frontage on the battlefield. That's kind of what that depicts. So when you go to this battle here, this is the total frontage and points that could be put on the battlefield, and then the AI went through and said, hey, you're going to be the most effective on the line, so I'm going to throw you out there, and that's how it does it. So Witherman's division got thrown out there first, so did Ruggles' division, and then Woods and Headman's also got put out here in round 1. Oh, sorry, that was the overall. Sorry. But again, just to illustrate here, these are going to give you rounds. The first hour of battle, we had Wood's brigade, Headman's brigade, Claiborne's brigade, Avery, Georgia cavalry, and a couple artillery. And then for each brigade, you're going to have a variety of statistics telling you how they performed in the battle. So, for example, with the artillery, we unleashed a devastating fire on the enemy in the first hour of battle. That's pretty typical for artillery. What that does is softens up the enemy for your infantry. And then when you go through each brigade, it'll tell you how they perform. So let's look at Headman's really quick here. Headman lost 17 hits in the first hour of battle, and it lost 111 overall power. But then when you hover over the heart or the power number, it'll tell you how much basically pain it inflicted on the enemy. So inflicted 10 hits, so lost 17 but inflicted 10, and then it inflicted 40 cohesion total. And these little bubbles here will tell you additional information about how they performed. Nearby supply resource increased the combat prowess. Your unit received a protection bonus from entrenchment, and your unit had a high hit probability. Additional things you'll see is that generals performed admirably in battle. It'll tell you that. Other circumstances, like over here, it'll say, hey, your men showed cowardice on the battlefield and fled. Down here, you managed to get some lucky shots. So in other words, first you have the overall statistics here on how things went on the overall battlefield. But then what you can do is you can go down here and look at how each brigade or support unit performed to give you some idea of how your army is currently constructed and what can be improved. Other things that'll be shown on here is that the enemy suffered a river crossing penalty, and perhaps that might explain why your unit performed well. Notice here for the 2nd Division, they performed brilliantly during this round, that sort of thing. So you can deduce a lot from here and then kind of act accordingly. So what I also want to speak to, though, is notice in the 2nd round, so 1st round we have Hardy and Headman, and then we got Johnston leading the overall command structure, even though he was in a different region. But round 2, Bragg showed up. So this is marching to the sound of guns. So notice here, even though we've got Humboldt County, that's where our forces were, and Breckenridge and so forth. We actually had Bragg we had Bragg at Madison, Tennessee. So Bragg heard the firing of guns, marched across the river, and came in to support. So he brought Ruggles and Withers divisions into the battle, into the fray. And so if you look at battle result on hour 2, all of a sudden it's Withers division here and Ruggles division, which is from Bragg, which then put the other generals' brigades into kind of a reserve status, because this was a far more lethal opponent to put on the battlefield. And so now notice all of a sudden the power is 1,100 for Withers division and 1,200 for Ruggles. And that's really what I think ended up seizing victory for the Confederates here, was that marching to the sound of the guns, bringing Bragg up, putting his divisions into battle against his divisions, and then end up succeeding in that situation. So again, this is just a really good illustration, I think, here for multiple things. One, how the battle or how the army hierarchy works. So again, I had Johnston here, the corps up here. The battle occurred up at Humboldt, but Johnston actually ended up leading it. And then marching to the sound of guns. So because Bragg falls under Johnston, Bragg ended up marching to the sound of guns up here because we had him on an offensive posture. Again, posture doesn't play, it's not overall determinative. So we could have had him on defensive and he still would have marched to the sound of the guns. But he may not have jumped in at hour 2 like he did here, because if he was on defensive, he would have jumped up and then maybe jumped in a little bit later. But because we had him on offensive, he jumped in hour 2. But then we had, again, the overall result and then the different hours of battle, and then evaluating how each brigade performed, and then being able to gather from that kind of some idea on how to perhaps restructure your army or reposition it in a way to maximize some of the things that happened here. Finally, just to finish off this tutorial, notice again, it'll tell you the day of battle it occurred. It'll give you the terrain where it occurred. And then finally, the line of battle down here, which if you're using Battle Planner, you may have been able to influence this. But this will tell you how the deployment occurred. In this case, it was balanced. And then finally, notice that the committed this round, there's 17 elements committed. And that's because we had an army command with the strategic level such that Johnston was able to employ more elements on the battlefield than perhaps would have been authorized previously. In this case, 26. So, but that's again, not accounting for the 180 points, which I guarantee you when Bragg came on, his divisions used up a lot of points to field that battle. So, all right. So hopefully this tutorial was helpful for you. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, obviously please leave them in the comments section. Or if you have something you'd like to add to this discussion or tutorial, obviously I'm always open to those sort of things. And then finally, please, if you don't mind, like the video if you found it informative and helpful. Not so much for us AoE bros, but more for other people to find the videos so they might find it helpful. I would tell you when I started playing this game a few months ago, I found it very difficult to find YouTube tutorials that were helpful. I would say Spink was very helpful, so I'm going to give a shout out to him. But beyond that, I didn't find any of the tutorials for this game. So it's not to say they're not out there, but perhaps they weren't getting enough likes. And my hope is that this will get enough likes and get it out there for other people to enjoy. Next tutorial, check it out. I'm going to do several more. This isn't the last one. And hopefully between all the different tutorials I'll do, they'll be overall very helpful for you and allow you to succeed in the game. Thank you.